You know, several years ago, I delivered an Easter sermon where I spent most of my time refuting the belief in a bodily resurrection of Jesus. I noted the more than 20 discrepancies in the various gospel accounts of this purported event. I noted the unbelievable account in Matthew's gospel that at the time that Jesus died, there was an earthquake and many, many bodies that were buried outside of Jerusalem came to life, and all of these formerly dead people came streaming into Jerusalem. I asserted that if this had actually happened, certainly some secular historian like Josephus would have taken note of it. And then, of course, 40 days later, the gospel account says that Jesus ascended like a rocket into heaven. Now, I said that it was very difficult for me to accept these events as actually having happened and as actually being the basis for celebration on Easter. I said the most important thing is that somehow the spirit and underlying message of Jesus survived his death, and that his disciples eventually moved beyond their fear and guilt to be implacable carriers of his message, and that this message continues today, where the poor are attended to and the naked are clothed, the hungry are fed, the homeless are given shelter, and those who are suffering injustice are ministered to. And, I pointed out persons such as Sister Teresa and Martin Luther King Jr., who were disciples of Jesus, who continue this message. And I asserted that the immortality of influence for good, it was a possibility for all of us to some degree. Well, after the service, a fellow came up to me who was very disturbed. He said, I'm very upset by your sermon. Now, I knew that he was from a Jewish background and his wife was from a Catholic background, and they were trying to find some common ground in our congregation, which I was very pleased, and we often do, provide that place for people. But immediately I began to think, well, maybe he was upset about some of the positive things I said about Jesus. And so I was forming the rebuttal in my mind, how I was going to say that I was not talking about the theological Jesus, the second person of the Holy Trinity. I was thinking and I was speaking of Jesus, the Jew. But then he said something that just really surprised me. He said, I happen to believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And I just wonder, is there a place for me in this Unitarian Universalist congregation? You could have knocked me over with a feather. I was very surprised by this. But I assured him that historically, many Unitarians and Universalists had believed in the literal resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and that he wasn't alone in this. And I was sharing my personal experience and belief, which is the want of Unitarian Universalist ministers. And our purposes and principles hold us together in a broad array of religious viewpoints, and that certainly he and his wife had a place within our congregation. And I went on to say that many Easter themes have many different resonances with Unitarian Universalists. There are those who believe in immortality of the soul, those who believe in the resurrection of the body, those who have believed in the immortality of influence and in reincarnation. And there even was a time in our Universalist side of our tradition where many people were into spiritualism or communication with loved ones who had died. Well, I'm happy to say that his wife and he did join our congregation, became very active, and established an interfaith citywide communication discussion group, which was very successful. But ever since that experience, I have never given an Easter sermon where I was quite as direct about debunking the Easter myth of literal resurrection. And because I believe, and more importantly, Jesus' Spirit is alive today in our first Unitarian Universalist Universalist principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And he's alive in encouraging us to enjoy life. You know, I grew up in an evangelical tradition where it was stressed that Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. But yet when I read the Gospels, it was eating and drinking and celebrating and eating and drinking and celebrating. Jesus was a regular party animal. In fact, his detractors said that he went a little too heavy on the wine. You know, that has impressed me about Jesus as a messenger of joy. And of course, the joy that he took in nature. His words, consider the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. But Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And of course, that experience of nature came out so nicely in the song we just heard from Ann and Hope. But it has been so important even in pre-Christian times as a time of celebration when the earth comes to life again in new and in wonderful ways. And it behooves us to follow the advice of the poet Wordsworth when he says, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, and little we see in nature that is ours. We get somehow, we miss the joy and appreciation of nature. Even something like hearing the birds. Do you ever just stop morning? You may be out on a walk to stop and listen to the birds. For many, many years, I offered a early Easter morning sunrise service. And at one point, we would sing Morning is Broken. And then we'd have just a period of silence at dawn as the birds begin to do their thing. And it's, you know, one of the few times I realized at that time that I stopped and really listened. And now I do it regularly. Now, I've had to make some amendment to my celebration of Easter since moving to South Florida. You know, I spent the previous portion of life, all of it, in northern climes where I so look forward to the end of winter and the coming and the greening of spring. And of course, in Florida, it's green all year round. So I've had to have some psychological changes in terms of Easter, especially when it comes to church life. You know, Easter was always the best attended service of the year. And of course, we had special music always and a very festive time. But I found in South Florida that I did not look forward to Easter Sunday because our snowbirds had already started to go home to the north. And I began to grieve their loss. So in my mind, Easter was changed to the second Sunday in January when all the snowbirds were there, when you had the greatest attendance. So I just do that as an aside of how in my Easter celebrating and thinking, I've had to make that amendment. But secondly, I in terms of joy, I think joy arises when we take note of even the small inconsequential things in our life. And I think that came through for you, as it does for me, in that poem by Anne Sexton about the morning. And a number of years ago, I came across a wonderful piece by Holly Bridges Eliot in her book, Beholding God in Many Faces. And she said, I remember this illumination happening to me one noontime as I stood in the kitchen and watched my kids eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We were having a most unremarkable time on a nondescript day in the midst of the most quotidian of routines. I hadn't censed the table. I hadn't sprinkled the placemats with holy water or uttered a sanctifying prayer over the Wonder Bread I was feeling particularly spiritual. I wasn't feeling particularly spiritual, but I don't know what prompted this, but I stopped abruptly in mid-bustle and mid-wool gathering and looked around as if I were opening my eyes for the first time. The entire room became luminous and so alive with movement that everything seemed suspended, yet pulsating for an instant like light waves. Intense joy swelled inside me, and my immediate response was gratitude for everything. everything in that space. The shelter of the room became a warm embrace. Water flowing from the tap seemed a tremendous miracle. And my children became for a moment not my progeny or my charges or my tasks, but the eternal beings of infinite singularity and complexity, whom I would one day in an age to come apprehend in their splendid fullness. I just love that statement because it's been so true in my life. I would one day in an age to come apprehend in their splendid fullness. Attention is called for on this Easter Sunday, as every day. It comes from so many different traditions. Both the Quran and the Talmud claim that on Judgment Day, each of us will be judged adversely for every joy we have refused. And I just love that Buddha's saying, may all sentient beings be well. May they be free from suffering and the root of suffering. And may they know the joy that comes after sorrow. And that brings me to my third point of joy, that joy comes to us when we take note of and celebrate the healing that takes place after our losses. Of course, I mentioned that in reference to Jesus' disciples, but I say to all of you today, who in the hearing of my voice has come thus far in your life totally unscathed? None of us. We all have deep losses, do we not? Of lost loved ones, of jobs, of a part of our own body, of a marriage, of a faith, of abilities, losses which are grievous to us. Now, thank goodness that the process of healing is natural, and over time, we so often experience resurrection. I'm not saying that this is foolproof, that it happens to everyone every time after every loss, but it's quite common, is it not? And I just love how President Biden is ministering to this nation in its grief during the pandemic. And he said many times, eventually he said, a smile will come to your lips before a tear comes to your eye as you remember loved ones lost during the pandemic. And then he goes on to say, I guarantee it. Well, I'm not going to guarantee it. Maybe I don't have that degree of presidential authority, but it's so often is the case, is it not? One of the wonderful natural aspects, the joyful aspects of life. You know, my mother died in October of 2000, and my brother, Philip, videotaped the service, and he sent it to me. And I just could not bring myself to watch that because it had been such a traumatic event, that funeral of my mother, that I just didn't want to relive it. I had given a eulogy, as did my brother Tim and my sister Janice, and I was still upset because the minister we asked to do the eulogy, who had known my mother for over 50 years, said virtually nothing about my mother and her life and her character and her achievements, which were many. But he used this as an opportunity to evangelize us and call us to belief in Jesus Christ as our personal Savior. And I didn't want to watch that again, but I was pleased to know my brother had deleted that part of the tape. So when I finally watched it, I took the chance. Can I do this? I was so pleasantly surprised that a healing had taken place within me. And it was a joyful experience to watch that tape again, as I heard really for the first time what I had said, and my brother Tim and my sister Jan, regarding the ongoing meaning of my mother's life in terms of our lives. Healing, resurrection, one of the joyous aspects of life. And fourth, I want to say that joy arises when we take note of the old saying, enjoy yourselves, for it may be later than you think. Think of that story about Jesus being anointed with costly perfume shortly before his death, just a few days at the most before his death. Now, I wish Jesus had not said that, the poor you will always have with you, because that's been the basis for laissez-faire economics and foregoing of a robust social safety net. And of course, it isn't true. I think in some of the countries with robust safety nets like the Scandinavian countries. But I wish he had just said, as our reading said this morning, don't be so hard on this woman. Let it go. Don't be so picky. But she had the joy of giving to him, and he had the joy of receiving shortly before his death. If she had put it off any longer, it likely would have been too late. Too late. The phrase enjoy yourself, it's later than you think, was brought to our country 85 years ago, maybe a little more now than 85 years ago. I just thought we always had it, but it was brought to this country by Dr. Frederick Loomis. He was a physician, and he was in his hospital one day, and he noticed the chart of a patient in the hospital with his same name, Loomis. And so he thought he'd pop in and say hello. But before he did, he said, I better talk to her doctor to see if this would be all right. And her doctor said, well, I don't know if she's going to want any visitors because she suffered the death of her newborn child just yesterday. But he went anyway, and he spent some time with her, sharing empathy and talking to her about her loss, and that was it. But 2 years later, he got a letter from this woman. She wrote, you may not remember me, but I'm the woman you visited 2 years ago when I was in the hospital. I was so sorrowful, so down, and your visit meant so much. It has been an important part of my process of healing, and I want to thank you. But I thought of you today because I'm in Beijing, China, and I was invited out to a beautiful Chinese home. And while we were there having lunch in the garden, I noticed a plaque up on the wall and asked for it to be translated. And the words were, enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. I thought of my circumstance. I've been putting off having another child because I'm still grieving, but I determined then and there that I would, Providence cooperating, have another child. But then I thought of you. On that day, you were in my hospital room and you were so weary, you were so weighed down, so tired. The nurses told me that later that you had spent almost all your waking hours with your patients. And I thought of you when I had that saying translated. I trust that you will take some time to enjoy yourself, for it may be later than you think. Well, the next morning he went to his office and said to his staff, I'm going to take a vacation. I haven't had one in years. And I'm going to go to South America, something I always wanted to do. So he called up his closest friend, Shorty, and said, would you go with me to South America? And he said, well, I'm in the midst of closing a business deal. I've been about it now for 4 months, and I just don't think I can afford to go. Well, Dr. Loomis read the letter to him, and then Shorty said, well, I've been waiting for them for 4 months. They can wait for me for a bit longer, and said, I'll go with you. And they went, and they had a wonderful trip together in South America. And several years later, when Shorty was dying, and the two of them were reminiscing, Shorty said, I'm so glad we took that time to be together on that trip. You know, sometimes paradoxically, it's at life's most joyous times when we realize that it is not going to last forever. Enjoy yourself. It may be later than you think. You know, the Egyptians had a wonderful myth that at death, I don't know if it's so wonderful as I think about it, but that at death, a person would be confronted by the god Osiris, who would ask them 42 questions about their life. And the final question being, did you find joy? And did you help others find joy? And if that question was answered affirmatively, the person would move into a wonderful afterlife. But if the person's answered in the negative, the person would be fed to a hippopotamus. Well, it behooves us, according to the Egyptians, to find joy and to help others find joy. And finally, joy comes when we open ourselves up to humor. It's been interesting for me to read about Easter customs in Christian history. And important part of that was humor on Easter Sunday. Often they didn't keep things under wraps and did some things we might consider to be sacrilegious. But for instance, during the middle of the service, the priest might throw colored eggs to the boys in choir in the balcony and receive a deluge of them back because a great joke had been played on the devil. The devil had thought he had won when Jesus was crucified, dead, and buried, but God raised him up and broke the power of the devil. What a joke. So Easter was a time of sharing jokes. So I want to share one with you that comes to mind, a religious joke. And I've always kind of liked this. I heard this many years ago, but it comes from the Second Vatican Council. And Pope John the 23rd could never keep straight two of the American churchmen, Cardinal Cushing and Cardinal Spelman. He got their names mixed up time after time. And about the umpteenth time, he apologized to Cardinal Cushing for forgetting his name and promising he would do better. Cardinal Cushing said, I just love this, he said, "Holy Father, that's all right. No one's infallible." Now, that's very subtle, but to me, I find it so humorous, perhaps a very good Easter story. Now, so much of what I said this morning is contained in the short reading I included in this week's newsletter from Frederick May Eliot, who was a minister of the Unity Church Unitarian in St. Paul and then became president of the American Unitarian Association for 20 years until his death in 1958. But he wrote this, "When I go to church on Easter, I expect to be reminded of the elemental truth that in this universe of ours, with all its hesitancies, timidities, and tragedies, the tides of life are flowing fresh, manifold, and free. And I expect myself to be caught up into participation in the universal chant of praise for the irresistible, shining glory of the great gift of life, which for a brief moment and in an infinitesimal degree, I have the privilege of sharing." So, happy, joyful Easter to all of you. Amen.